I kind of want to share a little bit. We talk about change in our society and how things are changing. Does anybody have any thoughts of why it's important to understand change in our business environment? Does anybody undergo change in what you're doing? Anybody? No? Yes? No? Yeah? Well, it's interesting. I think if we look at one example in the scriptures, where we see here in 475 BC approximately, the king spoke with wise men who understood the times. To me, that would suggest that times were always changing, even in Queen Esther's time. And so it's kind of amazing that change is not something that's new. And if we look at a couple of examples in Scripture, Prophet Joel talks about beat your plowshares into swords. But we also see Isaiah talking about they'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Well, does this really seem like a conflict? In one point, we're supposed to make weapons, another time we're supposed to make farm implements. Well, it suggests to me that biblically, in one point, we might do one thing, and something else, something quite different. So it suggests to me that there's a real difference in how we do this. So let me ask you a question. Is the future predictable? Anybody believe the future is predictable?
Only one.
Only one. Well, just looking back at some historical examples, I think that give us some insight from a human point of view. The Quarterly Review in the United States was a very well-known magazine, and it wrote, what can be more absurd than the prospect held out of locomotives traveling faster than stagecoaches? Well, clearly they were wrong. And on television, Lee DeForest, a very, very leading inventor, friend of Thomas Edison, said that, well, it's possible. Television is something that we just shouldn't waste any time dreaming of. Well, and clearly he was wrong. And on transportation, Popular Science magazine said, as a means of rapid transportation, this aerial navigation can never compete with the railroads. And obviously they didn't understand this. And the Literary Digest said on automobiles that the horseless carriage can never compete with the railroads or the bicycle. And clearly they were wrong. In my own personal experience, I had an interesting experience one time. I actually remember being sent the original offering for Microsoft. And I passed on it because I didn't understand the future. And I thought this Microsoft thing was kind of a high-risk tech venture that I didn't quite grasp. So I threw the thing in the wastebasket. Well, obviously, if I'd seen the future, I would have invested in that, and it would have been a pretty good investment. Well, the answer, I think, that we all kind of know in a sense, Scripture tells us, how do you know what will happen tomorrow? And there's a lot of scriptures that speak to that. But the reality is, I believe that in a human sense, we don't know what the future is going to be. And yet we go through times of change. So the question is, how do we deal with change? Well, there's some elements I think I'd like to kind of discuss for a minute. First is that we will tend to resist change in our humanness. Second, however, is that change generally takes place over an extended period of time. Small changes also tend to herald major changes. And therefore, we need to understand and focus on changes that have already occurred in our society. And we need to look at the concept of being market-driven. And we need to look and understand at the concept of focusing on our strengths. And we need to be willing to abandon things that are not working. And we also then need to focus on moving quickly. Time is not always our friend during times of change. Well, in a sense, I think we're going to resist change. And the question is, why do we do that? Well, I think one is we like to look at, we feel we have a right to consistent customers, consistent staff, consistent products. We think we have a right to profit margins. Does anybody like having your profit margin kind of, you feel it's assaulted? We like to kind of hold on to things that we like to do things our certain way. We don't like to change. Is there anybody here that really always likes to do things differently? Most of us don't. And there's I think an interesting word picture in the scripture where Jesus talks about somebody that really believed in the status quo, where we see that the land of a certain rich man was very productive. And we see in this passage about how all the person was going to do is get more goods and become become more comfortable, and everything was going to be fine, except we learned later that his very life was going to be taken that night. Now, if this was ever a picture of somebody who thought nothing was ever going to change, this was the guy. But yet, we learned from the scripture his very life was taken from him that day, so everything did change. So I think when we look at the concept of change, we have to kind of recognize that the more important our comfort zone, the more we want to hold on to things. We have our income flow, right? And any change that threatens our business threatens our income, and that's a pretty serious thing. If we feel threatened with 20, 30, 50% of our budget, that's a very serious thing. Our social structure too, because a lot of us when we're in business or ministry, our social structure is kind of wrapped around what we do, the people that we see, the things that we do. And so our social structure gets threatened during times of change, if things are going to get kind of messed up. And it's also our very view of who we are, our identity, our importance, isn't that right? So if things get changed and our business is threatened and we feel that we're kind of getting messed with, it's not only a threat to our income and our comfort, but it's a threat to the very essence of who we believe that we are. And so that in itself can be very, very threatening. Well, King Solomon wasn't immune to that. And we know that King Solomon said, you know, all my eyes I desired, I did not refuse them. I didn't withhold from my heart any pleasure. And here's King Solomon, the wisest person to ever live, kind of seeking his own comfort zone, so to speak. So we have to recognize that our humanness, that's something we're all going to do, but then we kind of ask ourselves, who's responsible for dealing with change? Well, we tend to say, you know, it's not fair. You ever felt that? It's not fair. Or we say, you know, we're entitled to our market position. How dare this competitor come in here and take my customer? How dare they cut my price? How dare they change something? In a sense, we kind of feel that we're entitled to that. Or somebody, just go do something. Somebody do something, but we don't want to blame ourselves, do we? We don't want to kind of blame ourselves saying, you know, I kind of messed up, I lost touch with my customer. Or we'll say, you know, the government should pass a law, the government should fix something, the government should just go do something, right? Somebody should go do something to kind of fix my problem. But is that really real? The reality is in the scriptures, Israel says, you know, rise. For this matter is your responsibility, but we'll be with you. Be courageous and act. And I would just suggest that during times of change, it's easy to blame somebody else. It's easy to blame circumstances. It's easy to kind of say somebody else needs to go do something. But the reality is, who in our business life has the responsibility for dealing with change? I think it's you and me, right? It's us. And the reality is, it's not something we're going to be able to deal with. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Edward Deming, who did a lot of tremendous work on quality and how we need to improve the quality in our business life. Well, he said a neat little quote. He said, survival of a business is not compulsory. In essence, businesses come and go. And we know that more businesses go out of business than will ultimately succeed. And I came from Detroit, Michigan, which kind of used to be the auto capital of the world, is still struggling to hold on to that title. But before that, what a lot of people don't know is it was the wood stove manufacturing capital of the world at the turn of the century. And what about all those companies that made wood stoves? None of them make wood stoves anymore. And over a period of time, they had to evolve and change from making wood stoves to making something else. Electric stoves, auto parts, and different things like that. Look at the evolution of Wells Fargo, the old stagecoach delivery kind of company, to the modern banking company. They've gone through change after change after change in 100 and some years. Well, King Solomon kind of tells us something else. He tells us, you know, there's a time to plant and a time to uproot. You know, we've all read this scripture, I think. A time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to search, and a time to give up is lost, a time to keep, and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart, and a time to sew together. And so we know there's times to kind of do one thing and do something else. So I kind of want to address something that